In the splendid setting of an ancient church in the middle of a peaceful suburb where rows of old oak trees cast shadows against the stained glass windows, a grand day was taking place, the wedding day of David Anderson and Olivia. The late afternoon sunlight shone through the stained glass, covering everything in a golden light as beautiful as a fairy tale. The guests, dressed in fine clothes, were gathered. From David's longtime friends to successful colleagues, all were present to congratulate the happiness of a couple that everyone believed was a match made in heaven. The sounds of laughter and congratulations echoed everywhere, creating a jubilant atmosphere. But in the crowd, there was a small pair of eyes silently observing everything. The eyes of Mason, David's 10-year-old son. Mason stood quietly in the far corner of the church, his small, neat suit, his slightly loose leather shoes making him limp slightly. While the other children were playing and laughing, Mason just stood there, his arms tightly holding the pillow containing the wedding ring, his eyes filled with something heavy and difficult to say. The boy followed every step of his father, the man he loved most in the world, standing on the stage, his eyes sparkling with happiness as he waited for his bride. But contrary to the joy of the people around him, Mason's heart was filled with an indescribable fear. No one noticed that worried look. No one realized that behind the handsome suit was a small trembling heart. Mason knew that he was not invited here just to be a cute ring bearer, but because he was the only one who knew the truth about Olivia, the woman who was about to enter their lives. If you love engaging, dramatic stories and thrilling cases, don't forget to subscribe to the channel today. Each video is a journey full of surprises, taking you into the world of unsolved mysteries. Join me in exploring, analyzing, and feeling every detail of the story. The melodious music rang out, signaling that the bride was about to enter the wedding hall. The guests all turned their heads, eagerly waiting. The church door slowly opened, revealing Olivia in a pure white wedding dress, as gorgeous as a princess from a fairy tale. Her curly blonde hair was long, her face was perfectly made up with a gentle smile. She walked slowly and gracefully, making everyone admire her. David looked at Olivia, his eyes filled with love, mixed with a bit of emotion. After years of raising his child alone, after the pain of losing his wife, he thought he had found the last person to spend the rest of his life with. But perhaps only Mason knew the truth was not so beautiful. The boy clenched the ring pillow in his hand, his eyes following Olivia with a conflicted heart. Scary images appeared again of the time she scolded him when his father was not home, the time she said cruel things that hurt him, and, most importantly, the plot he overheard on the fateful phone call. Once we get married, everything will be ready. Life insurance will change our lives. And the boy? He'll be a burden. Those words still rang in Mason's head like a nightmare. How could he let his father, the person he loved the most, fall into Olivia's trap? Mason had tried to tell his father, but David had only patted his head and laughed. "Mason, Olivia loves you. You just need to give her time, son." The boy understood that if he didn't do something today, his father could be in danger, or worse, lose his life. But how could he stop that, when everyone believed that Olivia was the guardian angel who appeared just in time to save their family? Now, as Olivia approached David, her eyes swept over Mason for just a split second, a cold look that made the boy shiver. No one noticed it except him. To everyone else, she was still the perfect bride, but Mason saw clearly that behind that gentle smile was a cunning fox. The music stopped. The whole church fell silent as the pastor began. "Today, in the presence of our family and friends, we gather here to witness the holy union of David Anderson and Olivia Carter." Mason took a deep breath, his heart pounding. All eyes were on David and Olivia. Only he realized the terrible ending was coming. He looked at his father for a long time, as if wanting to imprint that image in his heart, before he decided to do what a 10-year-old had never done before in his life: stop his father's wedding. But when was the right time? When the pastor asked, "Who objects to this marriage?" Or even sooner? The boy swallowed, looking around. Everyone was smiling, happy. No one knew the hidden truth. Mason felt like he was lost in a sea of people who understood him. And then he looked at his father, the man he loved, the man who held him and cried when his mother died, the man who taught him how to stand firm in this life. He knew, if he didn't stand up, no one would save his father. If anyone sees a reason why the two of you shouldn't marry, please speak up. The pastor's words echoed. Mason closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Memories of the past rushed back like a storm as Mason stood in the middle of the aisle, his heart swaying between love for his father and fear of the future. The image of the day his mother died still haunted him like it was yesterday. 2 years ago, David Anderson was a strong man but always filled with endless sadness. The sudden departure of his wife Sarah Anderson, in a terrible car accident, left an irreplaceable void. Sarah was the heart and soul of that small house, the mother Mason was always proud of. David's support through many storms. Mason clearly remembered the nights when father and son hugged each other and cried in the cold house. David promised his son, "It will always be just the two of us, Mason. I will protect you. No one can replace your mother." But then Olivia appeared. Olivia came like a strange wind, carrying beauty, gentleness, and sweet words that made David think he found light after a long night. David was so lonely, and when Olivia walked in, he was like a drowning man grabbing a life buoy. At first, Mason also wanted to believe that this was a good thing. Although he still had many doubts, the boy tried to open his heart because he wanted to see his father happy. He remembered the first time he met Olivia on a gentle autumn day. His father brought her home. "Mason, this is Olivia, my friend. She will have dinner with us tonight." Olivia smiled, leaning down in front of Mason. "Hello, Mason. I heard you're very brave." But behind that smile, Mason realized that her cold eyes were far from the gentleness she showed in front of David. From the very beginning, Mason had sensed something was wrong. She always did everything to please David, but when they were alone, Olivia showed annoyance towards Mason, sometimes with sarcastic and hidden words. "A grown child clings to his father all the time. Your father needs to have his own life too, Mason." Those words made Mason hurt, but he was afraid of making his father sad, so he kept everything to himself. As time passed, David became more and more immersed in his new love, seemingly forgetting the old promises he had made to Mason. The evenings that father and son used to gather together now became awkward meals for three. Mason sat there, alone in his own home, watching his father laugh and talk with Olivia, sometimes radiant as if he had never experienced any pain. And then the most heartbreaking day came when David announced, "Mason, Olivia and I have decided to get married. You will have a new family, a new mother." A new mother? Mason was stunned. While David looked at his son with eyes waiting for approval, Mason felt like his world had collapsed. But the tragedy did not stop there. One day, while returning home early from school, Mason accidentally overheard Olivia talking on the phone, and what he heard turned his life upside down. "Trust me, Mark. What are you worried about? He's madly in love with me. After the wedding, I'll be the beneficiary on the life insurance. One accident, and that's it. The kid? I can handle it. Just get through the wedding." Mason was speechless. His ears were ringing, his heart was pounding. He was scared, angry, and heartbroken. The father he loved was being lied to, his life was in danger, and Mason himself? He was just an obstacle to their plot. From that day on, Mason began to change. He became quiet, had trouble sleeping, and his studies declined. But David was so absorbed in his new joy that he didn't realize that his son was gradually sinking into anxiety and fear. Mason cried alone at night, missing his mother so much, wishing she was still alive to protect them. Loneliness and obsession were like a dark storm in the heart of the 10-year-old boy. And then today, the day the boy feared the most finally came, the day of his father's wedding to Olivia. During the wedding, when Olivia walked in her pure white wedding dress, David saw her as the light of his life, while Mason only saw a darkness engulfing his family. Mason remembered his mother. He remembered the days when she sang lullabies, the bedtime stories, the warm hugs. "Mom, what must I do to save Dad?" That question echoed in his heart forever. And then, When the pastor said, "If anyone has any reason to object to this marriage, speak up," Mason knew he could no longer remain silent. The sunlight from the tall glass windows shone down on the altar, drawing magical shimmering bands of light. The piano played slowly, spreading throughout the space as if inviting happiness to come closer. The guests sat neatly on the long benches, all radiant, eagerly waiting for the happy moment of David and Olivia. But amidst the cheerful chatter, a small heart was tightening, heavy with fear and anxiety. Mason sat in the first row, his tiny hands tightly clutching the pillow containing his wedding ring, his trembling fingers clenched until they turned white. His eyes stared at his father, the man he loved the most, who was about to walk into a deadly trap without even knowing it. Mason's mother's image flashed before his eyes, her warm smile, her loving voice comforting him whenever he had nightmares. His mother was the only person who had ever told him, "You must always protect the person you love, even if you have to do the hardest thing." And today, Mason understood. He had to do the hardest thing to stop his father from marrying a woman he knew was evil. The wedding bells began to ring. Mason heard whispers. How beautiful, the bride. Oh, this wedding dress must have cost a lot. David is so lucky to have found Olivia. Those words were like a knife cutting into the boy's heart. Everyone was happy for his father. Only he knew Olivia's mask. The big door opened. Olivia walked in, holding a bouquet of white flowers, her charming smile like an angel descending from the clouds. But only Mason could see the cold, calculating gaze hidden behind it. He trembled. His heart was pounding. What should I do now? Will my father believe me? Mason whispered to himself, his eyes brimming with tears. The pastor's voice began to ring out. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to witness the sacred union of David and Olivia." Mason bit his lip, his heart struggling fiercely. He knew that if he didn't say anything, his father would fall into a trap. But if he said anything, who would believe him? A child? Suddenly, Olivia turned to Mason, a perfect smile on her face, but her eyes were filled with menace. "Sit still. One word and your father will suffer for you." The boy shivered, cold sweat pouring down his temples. And then, "If anyone has any reason to object to this marriage, please speak up now or forever hold your peace." The words exploded in Mason's mind, like his mother calling from heaven, like the last chance to save his father. Mason stood up. The whole church was stunned. "Stop, Dad, don't marry her." The whole room fell silent. All eyes turned to the little boy, trembling but his eyes shining with courage. David looked at his son, surprised. "Mason, what's wrong with you? Why?" Olivia's face changed. "David, he's probably just worried. Mason, come here, honey." Her voice was honeyed, but Mason immediately recognized the lie. "No, Dad, she's bad. I heard her talking to someone named Mark. They want your insurance money. She said she'll kill you." The room exploded in whispers. David was speechless. His hands shook as Mason looked at his father, his eyes watery but determined. "What did you say, Mason? You don't understand. I heard her talking to Mark, I swear. I found the insurance papers on her computer too. I'm not lying, Dad." Mason choked, tears starting to well up. Olivia tried to stay calm now, but her anger was evident. "Enough, David, you can't let him ruin our wedding day, okay? He's just making it up," Mason shouted. "No, I'm telling the truth. I swear to Mom. She told Mark I was a burden, and she'll deal with me after she gets the insurance money." David collapsed into his chair, holding his head. Every word felt like a knife stabbing at his heart. The woman he loved, the one he thought was his savior, now turned out to be a devil in angelic disguise. The atmosphere in the church seemed to freeze. A man stood up, Mr. Jack, David's best friend, also Mason's godfather. "David, you need to check this out. I know Mason. He's not the kind of kid who lies." David raised his head, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. "Mason, are you sure? Absolutely sure?" Mason stepped forward, took his father's hand, looked deep into his eyes. "Dad, I don't want to lose you like I lost Mom. I love you. I wouldn't dare lie." Those words were like thunder in David's ears. He turned to Olivia, his voice trembling. "Olivia, look me in the eyes and tell me that everything Mason said is not true." Olivia was silent. A moment later she turned away, her eyes cold, leaving David and Mason among the astonished eyes of the entire hall. David collapsed, hugging Mason tightly. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "Son, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not believing you. I was wrong." The audience broke out. Some people wiped away their tears. A few guests came forward, placing their hands on David's shoulders, as if sharing this pain. The atmosphere of the wedding ceremony now seemed suffocated. All eyes were on David and Mason, while Olivia's white dress was now just a symbol of betrayal. The wedding bouquets were scattered on the floor, the half-finished wine glasses on the table that no one bothered to touch. A day that was supposed to be the happiest day now turned into an unexpected tragedy. David hugged Mason tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, the boy would disappear from his life, like Mason's mother had left forever. "Son, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was wrong for not listening to you," David whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Mason's little hands were shaking, but he still patted his father's back the way he had seen his mother comfort David on sad days. "I'm fine, Dad. Just believe me, that's enough." At that moment, Jack, David's best friend, stepped forward gently but firmly. "David, you need to do something. Not just for you, but for Mason. We need to call the police." David was stunned, his face frozen. He had never thought in his life that he would have to call the police because of the bride right at the wedding. Mason squeezed his father's hand, looking up. "Dad, if she runs away, I'm afraid no one will find her." His son's words seemed to stab David's heart. He nodded slowly, and then, in front of hundreds of people, David pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Hello, is this the police? I need to report an attempted murder. My fiancée, she ran away when my son exposed her during the wedding. I need your help." David's voice was shaky but firm. Less than 15 minutes later, police cars with flashing red and blue lights were parked in front of the church. 2 officers walked in, their faces stern. "Mr. Matthews?" An officer approached, his voice low. "Yes, it's me." David stood up, holding Mason's hand tightly. "We've received a report of an attempted murder. Please tell us what happened." David swallowed, then recounted everything. Every accusation Mason made, every detail he discovered, from the secret insurance contract, the phone calls with Mark, the times Olivia abused Mason when they were alone at home. Mason stood next to his father, his hands clasped together, his voice still shaking but determined. "I heard her say that after the wedding there would be an accident, and my dad would die. She told Uncle Mark about it." Officer Rivera sat down at Mason's eye level, his gaze softening as if to soothe the boy. "You did well, Mason. Very brave of you to say that." While a group of officers stayed behind to take statements from the guests, another team issued an urgent search warrant for Olivia and Mark. "What's her real name?" Officer Johnson asked. "Olivia Stone. At least she said she was," David replied, his voice bitter. "We'll run through the records, check for fingerprints if there are any. If she's ever cheated on anyone, we'll find out." Mason looked around at the guests, some of whom nodded at him, their eyes sympathetic. But he felt a greater worry. Would Olivia try to come back? Will she get revenge? As the police gathered information, David suddenly remembered something. He turned to Jack. "Jack, do you remember a few days ago I talked about Olivia asking me to sign a new will, leaving all the assets to her and Mason if something happened to me?" Jack paled. "David, you haven't signed it yet." "No, but she still has the draft." The police heard it, immediately asking David to provide all the relevant documents. A phone rang. Mason shuddered when he realized it was Olivia's phone. She was calling David. David and the police looked at each other, then turned on the speakerphone. "David, honey, what just happened was terrible. I don't understand why Mason did that. He must be scared. I'm panicking. Can you come see me?" Olivia's voice was still as sweet as ever, but the police immediately recognized the cunning in her tone. Officer Rivera signaled for David to continue. "Olivia, where are you? I'm so worried about you." David tried to stay calm. "You're in a hotel outside the city. Can you come here? We need to talk." Officer Johnson immediately took down the information and ordered the patrol team to go to the location Olivia mentioned. After hanging up, David hugged Mason. "Dad promised to protect you. No matter what happens, we'll get through it together." Mason looked up, his eyes red. "I just need you by my side." Looking at his small but strong son, David understood that it was Mason who saved his life and saved his broken family. Darkness gradually fell, but for David and Mason, tonight would no longer be a normal night. The flashing police lights in front of the church had completely turned off, but David's heart still ached. What Mason said, the evidence of Olivia's plot, all of it was swirling in his head like a whirlwind. David held his son's hand. His hand was cold, but he still tried to smile to reassure Mason. "Don't worry, I promise. From now on, no one will hurt you again." But David himself had no idea how tense things would be. At the police station, while David and Mason were working with officers Johnson and Rivera to get statements, the police received a report from the patrol team that they had tracked Olivia to a small hotel in the suburbs. Officer Johnson turned to David, his eyes serious. "Mr. Matthews, we are preparing to take action. But I have to ask, are you willing to cooperate to end this?" David looked at his son, then clenched his hand. "I will do anything to protect my son." The plan was drawn up. David would pretend to agree to meet Olivia at the hotel as she wanted, but David would be accompanied by 2 undercover officers, and the task force would always be ready at close range. Mason was kept safe at the police station, along with a social worker. David held his son for a long time before getting into the car with the police. "I'll be back soon, son." Mason looked at his father, trying to hold back his tears, his voice hoarse but firm. "I trust you, Dad. Be careful." That moment of parting, which seemed forever, made the father's heart ache. Darkness covered the road leading to the hotel, the yellow street lights casting weak streaks of light. David walked in, keeping his composure but his heart pounding. He walked straight to room 207, where Olivia had arranged to meet him. 2 plainclothes officers followed closely behind, pretending to be guests. The door opened slightly, and Olivia appeared in plain clothes, but her eyes still held the cold, wild look. "David, you're here. I know you won't leave me." Her voice was gentle, but there was a hint of intrigue in the depths of her eyes. David took a deep breath. "We need to talk, Olivia." "Yes, honey." Olivia curled her lips, holding a glass of wine to David as if everything was normal. "Olivia, why did you do that? Mason is a child. Are you really going to hurt him and me?" David spoke bluntly, his voice trembling with anger and pain. The question made Olivia stunned for a moment, but then she laughed coldly. "You know, David, love and money sometimes can't go together. I have no other choice." "What about Mark? What do you plan to do after I die?" David continued, his heart aching. Olivia's eyes immediately sharpened like knives, revealing her true nature. "Mark is my future, and you're just my ticket to get there." At that moment, the police rushed in, guns pointed at Olivia. "Olivia Stone, you're under arrest for attempted murder and financial fraud." Olivia was stunned, looked around in panic, then shouted, "David, you set me up. You can't do this to me." David looked at her, his eyes filled with resentment. "I didn't set anyone up. You did it yourself. Mason and I deserve to live in peace." Olivia was handcuffed, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were still filled with hatred. "You will regret it. You and that kid will both regret it." When they returned to the police station, David hugged Mason. "It's over, son. She will never hurt us again." Mason rubbed his head against his father's chest, whispering, "I was scared, Dad." David stroked his son's hair, his eyes filled with tears. "I know, son, but you're so brave. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have seen her true face." Officer Johnson approached, patted David's shoulder. We found a copy of the insurance contract in her room, and a lot of other evidence. She won't get away." At that moment, as if 1,000 pounds had been lifted off his shoulders, David turned to Mason, smiling through his tears. "From now on, it's just you and Dad. No one can separate us." After all the shocking events, David and Mason returned to the house that used to be a warm home, now filled with painful memories. The house was heartbreakingly quiet. Darkness covered every wall. Every corner seemed to still be haunted by the harsh words Olivia had spread. David sat down on the sofa, his head in his hands, tears falling silently. He looked at Mason, the boy who now no longer had the innocent innocence of the day he first introduced Olivia. Mason's deep eyes seemed to contain the hurt that adults sometimes couldn't understand. "I'm sorry, Mason," David choked, his voice trembling. Mason, even though he was only 10 years old, walked over and sat down next to his father. He wrapped his small arms around David, as if he was the one who supported his exhausted father. "I'm fine, Dad, as long as you're with me." Those words were like a knife stabbing into David's heart, and also the last ray of light that helped him stand up. But the following days were not easy. The press began to hunt for David. They didn't care about his and his son's pain, they just wanted a sensational story. The headlines on the newspaper pages: "Groom betrayed, fiancé in shocking murder plan. Brave boy exposes wicked woman who swindled at wedding." Every time David went out, he felt prying eyes and whispers. Mason, when he went to school, also had to face whispers. Curious children asking, "Did your stepmother plan to kill your father? How did you survive?" Mason could only bow his head in silence. Every day at school became a new nightmare. David began to lose sleep, haunted by Olivia's cold eyes, by the thought that "I used to love a murderer." He woke up in the middle of the night, sweating profusely, thinking that Olivia was still lurking in the darkness. Mason lost faith in adults, afraid of everyone around him. Every time the phone rang, he trembled and hid in his room. One night, David woke up to the sound of Mason sobbing in the dark. He rushed into his son's room, saw Mason huddled in the corner, eyes wide with fear. "I dreamed of her, Dad. She came back to find me. She said she would take you away forever." David hugged his son, his heart aching. "No one can hurt us anymore, Mason. I swear." But he knew just a promise was not enough to heal the pain Mason had suffered. Realizing that he could not bear it all by himself, David sought out a family counselor, Mrs. Grace Thompson, an older woman with kind but tough eyes. At the first meeting, David was confused when he looked at Mrs. Grace. His voice lowered. I don't know where to start. I feel like I've ruined everything." Mrs. Grace smiled gently, her eyes looking deeply at David. "Actually, the most important thing is that you realize you need help. That's the first step. And from today, we will work together." Mason sat next to his father, his eyes hesitant, but when Mrs. Grace gently asked, "Mason, what do you like to do the most?" Mason softly replied, I used to like to draw before Olivia came." "Then we'll redraw what you want. Redraw your world," Grandma Grace smiled. From the initial tearful conversations, Mason gradually opened up, telling about the days when Olivia threatened him, about the fear every night. David also learned to face the pain, to forgive himself. The father and son started new habits, walking around the park together every morning, reading books together in the evening, and cooking and laughing together on the weekends, like when Mason's mother was still alive. One day, when David and Mason were coloring in the backyard, Mason suddenly looked up and asked, "Dad, when I grow up, can I protect you like you protect me?" David looked at his son, tears rolling down his cheeks, but this time they were tears of love and hope. "Son, as long as you are happy and safe, you will protect me." Under pressure from public opinion, David stood up strongly and decided to join a group of families who had been scammed and abused. He and Mason shared their stories so that those who had been hurt like them would know that they were not alone. At the first seminar, David stepped onto the stage, looked at the hundreds of eyes watching, held his son's hand tightly, and said, "I used to think I was a failure, the worst father in the world, but today I stand here to say that no one can take away our family when we still love each other." The whole room fell silent. Then there was applause, hugs, and sympathetic looks. And for the first time in many months, David and Mason smiled for real. From a tearful wedding, from the tragedy of betrayal, they stood up, found each other again, found family love. David and Mason are now not just a broken family, but a symbol of strength, of an unbreakable father-son relationship. The nightmare is not over yet. Mason is slowly coming back to normal after the biggest shock of his life. He has learned to believe in himself, to find laughter and safety in his father's arms. David, too, after months of struggling with guilt, has gradually accepted that he cannot change the past, but he can protect his son's future. But those peaceful days... One day, while the father and son were having dinner, an envelope with no return address was slipped under the door. David picked it up, his heart beating faster. When he opened the envelope, a photo fell onto the table. It was a photo of Mason, taken from a distance, right in front of the school gate. Below was a line scrawled in red marker. "You think you won? It's not over yet." There was no signature, no identification, but David knew exactly who had sent it. Olivia. David clutched the photo, his whole body shaking with anger and worry. He immediately pulled Mason close, checking his son from head to toe as if to make sure he was safe. "Dad, what's wrong?" Mason looked up, his eyes worried when he saw his father's expression. David took a deep breath, trying to stay calm so as not to scare his son. But inside, a storm was brewing. "It's okay, son. I'll take care of it." But David knew deep down this wasn't just a threat. This was a warning. Olivia was back, and this time it seemed like she wasn't hiding anything. The next morning, David didn't take Mason to school as usual. Instead, he took him to the police station to see Officer Johnson, who had helped them before. "She sent a picture of my son, taken right in front of the school. That means she's been following him." "I want a protective order. I want the police to monitor my area. I'm not going to let this happen again." Officer Johnson nodded, but his eyes were filled with worry. "We've been looking for Olivia for months, but she's very good at hiding. If she dares to leave a trace, it means she has a new plan." David felt a chill run down his spine. A new plan? Could it be Olivia wasn't just after David? Could it be her target was Mason? 2 days later, David's worst nightmare came true. That afternoon, Mason came home from school, but was nowhere to be seen. David drove to school, his palms sweating, his heart pounding as he saw the empty schoolyard. He ran to the principal's office, his voice cracking with fear. "Where's my son? He should have been home." The secretary checked the logbook, her eyes panicked. Mason left at 3, but no one came to pick him up. David felt like his world was collapsing under his feet. Olivia had done the unforgivable. She had kidnapped his son. Soon after, David's phone rang. An unknown number. "Hi." David's heart sank as the voice he'd hoped he'd never hear rang out on the other end. "Hello, David, do you remember me?" "Olivia." Her voice was sweet, but there was a cold cruelty underneath. "You must be panicking, right? But don't worry. Your son is fine, as long as you cooperate." David gritted his teeth, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What have you done to my son?" Olivia chuckled. "Nothing yet, but if you don't do what I ask, who knows? What do I want? Easy. Some money and a ticket out of the country. You have 24 hours to prepare. Otherwise, you'll never see your son again." 24 hours. That was all he had to save Mason. The police were involved, but they admitted that if Olivia was too careful, they might not find her before it was too late. David had only 2 options. One, to hand over the money, but didn't know if Olivia would keep her word. To follow the trail himself, risking his life to save his son. There was no time to think more. David had made a decision. He would not let his son fall into the hands of the devil. That night, David sat motionless in the living room, the dim light shining on his haggard, tired face, but his eyes were as sharp as knives. Next to him was a photo of Mason. The boy's innocent smile made David's heart ache. He quietly stroked his son's face in the photo, a silent promise escaping from the bottom of his heart. "Son, even if I have to sacrifice my life, I will bring you back." Outside, the wind blew strongly, rustling the fallen yellow leaves. The night seemed endless, but David knew he could not sit still. As soon as the sun began to rise, David was at the police station with evidence of Olivia's call. Officer Johnson looked at him worriedly. "David, I understand your concern, but Olivia is dangerous. We need time to track her down. You have to let the police handle it." David shook his head, his voice firm, but his eyes filled with pain. "I used to trust the system, and look, where is my son now? I can't wait another minute." Officer Johnson sighed. Finally, as if understanding the father's determination, he said softly, "If you're going to do anything, be careful. And here, take this." He pushed an old phone towards David, already pre-installed with GPS and directly linked to the police station. "If things get out of hand, press the red button. We're coming." David nodded, knowing that he probably had only one chance. David decided to follow what he knew about Olivia, her habits, the places she used to hang out, the old acquaintances she might have asked for help. He went to the cafe where Olivia used to meet her friends, where she used to whisper lies. The owner remembered her and whispered to David, "Last week I saw her come in here with a strange man, long hair, snake tattoo on his wrist." David paused. That man, it must be Mark, Olivia's partner. Not stopping there, David went to an old apartment that Olivia had rented before she met him. The old woman next door opened the door. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously when she saw David standing there. "That guy again? I told you she doesn't live here anymore." But when David showed her the picture of Mason and told her the story, the old woman's eyes softened, and she said softly, "Last night I saw a gray truck stop in front of this place. She got out and talked to a strange guy. The brown-haired boy in the back seat. He looked like the kid in the picture." David's heart skipped a beat. A clue. "Did you see the license plate?" The old woman thought for a moment and nodded. "I don't remember all of it, but it says 3 and K. I'm sure." As David drove toward the suburbs where Olivia had lived with Mark, his phone rang again. "Olivia." "You did a good job, David." Her voice was full of sarcasm. "You found my trail, but it's too late. I'm just calling to tell you this." Mason's cries came through the phone. "Dad, save me!" David gripped the steering wheel tightly, tears welling up in his eyes, but his voice was as steady as rock. "Olivia, don't hurt the boy. I'll give you the money you want. Let my child go." Olivia sneered. "I told you, David, I don't just want money. I want you to suffer. You took everything from me, and now I'm taking it back. If you want to see your son one last time, go to the old warehouse outside the city. Alone." It was already dark when David stood in front of the deserted door of the old warehouse. The wind was blowing. Each gust was cold. In the darkness he saw Mason tied to a chair, his face streaked with tears. Olivia stood behind him, holding a gun. Mark stood nearby, his eyes mocking. "You're here, David. Good." David walked in, his hands raised. "I brought the money. Let the boy go." Olivia curled her lips. "Do you think it's that simple? But maybe I should give you one last chance." She signaled to Mark. He held the gun close to Mason's head. David couldn't think anymore. He could only move forward, regardless of the danger. "If you want to kill anyone, kill me. Don't hurt my son." The air was tense as a string. Suddenly, from behind, the police burst in. "Put the gun down, police here." Officer Johnson followed the signal from the GPS phone. Mason was saved at the last moment. Olivia screamed and struggled like a cornered animal while being handcuffed, and Mark was restrained before he could pull the trigger. When all danger was over, David knelt down and hugged Mason tightly. "I'm here, son. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Mason burst into tears, hugging his father as if he was afraid he would disappear. "I knew you would come to save me. I believe in you." David tightened his arms, tears mixed with a burst of laughter. The next morning, sunlight flooded the small house. For the first time in days, David and Mason had a full breakfast together, without the ghosts of the past. David looked at his son, held his hand, and whispered softly, "From now on, it's just you and me. We'll be happy forever." That morning, the sunlight poured through the window, casting gentle rays on David's face as he sat quietly by Mason's bed. The boy was still sleeping soundly after the nightmares of the past few days. The rope marks on his son's tender skin were painful evidence of what Mason had endured. David looked at his son, his heart choking. He gently stroked Mason's soft brown hair, whispering, "I'm sorry, son. I didn't protect you like a father should. But from today on, I won't let anyone hurt you again." The warm sunlight shone on the tears that rolled down David's cheeks, as if the whole sky was sharing his pain and hope. A few days later, even though Olivia and Mark were arrested, David and Mason's life did not easily return to normal. At night, Mason still woke up with a start. Nightmares about Olivia, about her threats, her scoldings, still haunted him. "Dad, won't she come back?" Mason whispered, eyes wet, hugging David tightly in the middle of the night. David hugged his son, comforting him. "No, baby, I promise. I'll always be here. She will never hurt you again." But David knew that promise was not enough to soothe the pain in Mason's heart. However, this incident also caused a rift in David's family. Mason's parents and grandparents came to visit and could not hide their anger. "David, you should have realized it sooner. You should not have let such a woman into Mason's life." His mother, Mary, held her grandson's hand tightly, her eyes red as she looked at David. "Son, do you know what Mason has suffered? How blind you were." David bowed his head, choking on his words. "I know, Mom. I know it's all my fault. But please, Mom, please, Dad, help me make things right. Help me bring Mason back to normal life." After a moment of heavy silence, his father, Richard, approached, put his hand on David's shoulder, his eyes stern but full of love. "David, you are my son and Mason's father. Stand up. We will take care of him together." A tear silently fell from the corner of David's eye. One morning, Mason held a picture of his mother and went to sit next to his father. "Dad, I miss Mom, but I'm also scared of Olivia. I don't want to be scared anymore." David hugged his son tightly. "I'm proud of you, Mason. You're strong, and we'll get through this together." That day, for the first time, David took Mason to the park where they used to play. When he saw the other children playing, Mason initially held his father's hand tightly, his eyes still full of hesitation. But then, when he saw the balloons flying high in the sky, Mason softly said, "Dad, can I release the balloons?" Davy smiled and nodded. Mason ran towards the balloon seller, letting go of his father's hand for the first time to stand up on his own. As the balloons soared into the sky, Mason watched and smiled his first smile in many long, dark days. David, sitting next to his son under the bright sun, whispered, "Son, from today I promise that no matter what happens in this world, I will always be the one to protect you." Mason leaned on his father's shoulder, eyes closed, whispering, "I believe you." And that was all David needed to move on. As time passed, David and Mason's lives gradually stabilized, but deep down they both knew that the wounds in their hearts would take time to heal. One autumn afternoon, as the yellow leaves fell sparsely on the yard, David and Mason sat together on the porch, enjoying a cup of hot cocoa that David's mother Mary had just made. "Dad," Mason said softly, his small eyes watching the falling leaves, "I was afraid that I would never be happy again." David turned to look at his son, his heart aching, but also full of love. He gently stroked Mason's brown hair that fell over his forehead. "I was afraid of that too, Mason. But you taught me the most important thing." Mason looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Taught me what?" David smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "You taught me what courage is. I thought adults should teach you, but it turns out you saved me. I saw how strong you were when you stood up in the middle of the crowd on that wedding day to protect the truth. Not everyone dares to do that, Mason. Mason lowered his head, his cheeks red, but this time out of pride, not fear. But I don't want to make you sad. David hugged his son and whispered, "Thanks to you, I'm still sitting here with you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have known the truth. You didn't make me sad. You saved my life." During this time, David realized that he and Mason couldn't cope with everything on their own. David decided to let Mason join a support group for children who had experienced family shock. At those meetings, Mason got to play, laugh, and especially listen to children who were like him. There, Mason met Ben, a 9-year-old boy who had also lost his mother, and his father had remarried, then broken up again. After only a few meetings, Mason and Ben became close friends. One time, while Mason and Ben were playing, David came to pick up his son. He stood still as Mason told Ben, "My dad is different. He listens to me. He believes in me." David's eyes stung. Perhaps he was on the right track to healing his son. Life was more peaceful, but the scars from the shock still returned from time to time. Mason still woke up in the middle of the night, but now David always ran to his son, holding him in his warm arms. "I'm here, Mason. Always." During the day, they began to spend time on the simple things they had missed before. Cooking breakfast together, Mason helping to cut vegetables, even though his small hands were sometimes clumsy, but his eyes lit up with joy. Going fishing on weekends, where it was just the two of them in the calm lake, where David taught Mason patience. Camping in the wild, where at night father and son sat by the fire, telling each other about their dreams. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be someone who helps children like you." David nodded, tears welling up in his eyes with happiness. "I believe you can do it, Mason. You have the heart of a hero." One day, Mary gave Mason an old leather notebook. "She wanted you to keep this. This is your mother's diary." Mason timidly opened it. Soft lines appeared before his eyes, telling about the days when his mother was alive, about her dreams, about the stories she told Mason before he was born. "Your mother always believed you would be a special child," Mary whispered, her eyes filled with tears, "and now you have proven it." Mason hugged the diary tightly like a treasure. "I will always remember you, and I will live to make you proud." One beautiful morning, David and Mason went to the park. They looked at each other and smiled, their eyes filled with love and trust. "Mason, from now on we are a team forever. Dad and son, small family but strong." Mason nodded. "Dad and me, forever?" David held Mason's tiny hand, which contained extraordinary strength. David and Mason's story is not only a story of deception and betrayal, but above all, it is a story of unconditional love, of the strength of family in the face of pain. No matter how many times life knocks us down, if we still have someone who believes in us, who still loves us, we will always be able to stand up. Family is not a perfect place, but it is a place where we find forgiveness, healing, and unconditional love. And as Mason taught us, even the smallest child, when he or she dares to speak the truth, can save a life. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a comment, share, and spread this love to more people. And don't forget to follow us to discover more touching, humane stories. Family is everything, and sometimes all it takes is one brave person to speak the truth, and good things will come. Dear friends, after all that happened in the story of David and Mason, what remains most deeply, perhaps, is not just an evil plan being exposed, but the love and strength of family that can heal any wound, no matter how deep. This story reflects a heartbreaking reality that our society is facing every day. There are innocent children who are silently suffering in families that seem perfect from the outside. Those pains can be mental abuse, coldness, and contempt from adults who are willing to step into someone's life just for their own benefit without caring about the feelings of children. But at the same time, Mason's story also reminds us of a beautiful thing. No matter how small, the voice of truth always has the power to save. Even in the worst of circumstances, if there is true love in the family, there will always be a way back. And sometimes it is the children who seem to have weak souls who are the bravest, ready to stand up to protect the people they love, ready to do the right thing when adults turn their backs. A lesson for each of us. Always listen to children. Sometimes seemingly small signs, silence, fear of adults' eyes, bowing and avoiding, are actually cries for help that children cannot say out loud. Don't let blind happiness make you forget your loved ones. When you love someone new, always remember that children are not accompanied but are the heart, an inseparable part of your life. Families don't need to be perfect, but they need love and protection. A child who grows up in love, safety, and truth will become a kind and brave person. If you are a parent, take the time to listen and feel for your child more. Make sure that the child always feels loved and safe in his own home. If you are a child seeing your loved one in danger, do not hesitate to speak up. Even if you are small, your courage can save the life of the person you love. And if you are an outsider, when you see signs of violence, injustice, or hurt in someone's family, please do not stay silent. A word of inquiry, a helping hand, can change a child's life. Let's spread this message. If this story touches your heart, please leave a comment to share your thoughts. Click like to spread the message of love and protection for children together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue to accompany the humane and profound stories about life, family, and values that today's society needs more than ever. Comment now, "I will listen to my children more," or "Children need to be protected," to build a loving and responsible community together. For children, for a family, for a better society. See you in the next videos where the stories will continue to touch our hearts and awaken the best in us.